So, in class last time, we talked about equilibrium. We talked about supply and demand and their intersection. We learned how to label our graphs. We learned our mnemonic, where it is alphabetical, left to right. So we can count, we can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. P comes first, price comes first, before quantity. We learned that the line which is downward sloping is our demand curve. We remember that because they both start with a D, downward sloping demand curve. And we learned that our supply curve is the upward sloping one. And if we ever forget which way supply slopes, well, up is right in its name. Supply. And where these two things meet is that magical point called equilibrium. We label that with a P star and a Q star. And we learned that any deviation from this equilibrium, whether it's above the price or below the price, there's going to be some incentives for the producer specifically to increase or decrease the price. So, for instance, if the price were up here, the price is too high, we found that the quantity demanded would be much lower, much less than the quantity supplied. And that this inequality would create something. Do we remember what that name is, the thing that it would create? When we have more of something supplied than that is demanded.
Surplus.
Very good. Surplus. And because of the fact that we have a surplus, it's costly to hold these surpluses. We are better off as a business to get, half a loaf rather than none. We're better off to do a fire sale and 20% off or something like that, right? So we are going to be incentivized to lower the price. And we may think, okay, this is where it is. And then we see, oh no, there's still a bit of a surplus there. We need to lower it even more until we get to that magical point where everything that is supplied is demanded and everything that is demanded is supplied. Similarly, when the price is too low, what did we find? We found that the quantity supplied is now mismatched with the quantity demanded. The quantity supplied is too low compared to the quantity demanded at that particular price. This situation where we have demand outstripping supply is called what? Shortage. Very good. And when the producer sees that there is a shortage, it is in their economic incentive to drive greater revenues, drive greater profits. They are going to increase the price, seeing this shortage up until the point, and again, they may increase the price and do a little testing and say, oh, okay, at this price, we still have a bit of a shortage, so we can pump the price a little bit more until they find that magical price where everything that is supplied is consumed and everything that is demanded is produced and provided by the producers, by the suppliers. Now, what about some times where there are shortages and surpluses that stick around? So your book talks about two examples, and they're talked about in every single economics book. Two examples where market forces don't equilibrate the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So if we talk about the market for apartments in New York City. New York City famously has rent control. What does rent control mean? Well, we're going to find out. Rent control means that despite the fact that there is some equilibrium, and we don't know what it is because we don't allow the market to really find it, but for the sake of example, we're going to say that it's $1,600. Well, there is a law that states that the maximum allowable price is something like $800. So this is what we call a price ceiling. So this means you cannot charge more than $800. So what is going to be the result of such a policy? Well, at $800, let's take a look at how many apartments are going to be supplied. Well, looks like, according to the book, there's going to be 1 million apartments supplied per day. Doesn't really matter, per day, per week, per month, per year. It's just important to have some sort of specificity there. So at this rate, there's 1 million that are going to be supplied. But at $800, we see from this demand schedule over here, there's going to be far more than 1 million apartments desired by consumers. In fact, there's going to be 3 million apartments desired by consumers. So this is going to result in a shortage of 2 million. And if we would let the equilibrium price rise to where it naturally would go, we would end up with somewhere, and again, we have to guesstimate because we really don't know, we would end up with 2 million apartments rented at a higher rate. So these policies of rent control and of price ceilings that are what we call binding, this is a binding price ceiling. And by binding, I mean it's actually working. It's doing something. We'll talk about one that's non-binding in a second here, but just it's important for us to remember that this is a binding price ceiling. So the consequences of a binding price ceiling are twofold. Number one, 1 million people are able to get affordable apartments at $800, right? It's pretty good. However, if prices were allowed to rise, there would be 2 million apartments. There would be 2 million people getting apartments in New York City. So because of the rent control, yes, the apartments are cheaper for those who can get them, but there's 1 million less apartments available as a consequence of this policy. Does that make sense? So real quick, just as an aside, what's a non-binding price ceiling look like? So let's say that, the city of I don't know. Let's say the city of Rapid City decides to do a similar kind of thing, but let's say they don't do a lot of economic analysis in terms of the rental market and things like that, right? So let's say they say that no one can charge more than $1,200 for an apartment or something like that, right? Well, if the market equilibrium price is somewhere below that, let's say $950, then having a price ceiling that is above the $950 at that $1,200 amount is going to do nothing, right? Because what is it saying? It's saying you can't charge higher than this. And the market's going, we don't want, nobody's willing to pay that. People are paying $950. So in order for a price ceiling to work, it has to be binding, which means it has to be below the equilibrium. Does that make sense, everyone? And the way that I like to remember these, just like I have my fun mnemonics, right? Well, with this thing, a price ceiling makes sense because if you kind of imagine what's going on over here, right? This looks like a house to me. There's a door, there's some windows, right? Like a price ceiling that is binding makes the graph literally look like a house and looks like a ceiling. A price ceiling that is non-binding, you can't make a house out of this. Does that make sense? So just as a cute little mnemonic, a way to try to remember which one is which, price ceilings are below the equilibrium so that they bind, and they look like a house if you draw it in. Questions on price ceilings? All right. What about the opposite of a price ceiling? I know, we're in fascinating territory today. What's the opposite of a price ceiling? A price basement? Stay tuned. We'll find out. So a price floor is our opposite of a price ceiling. And for the most part, price floors are discussed when we talk about minimum wage laws. Employers would love to pay you less than the already low pay that you're getting for the service work that you do in restaurants and in retail jobs. They would like to pay you less. If they could, they would pay you, $3 an hour or something like that, right? Come on, tablet. However, the government steps in and says that's not an affordable, wage. No one can live off that. No one can purchase food and shelter and medicine and heat and all the other, necessities of life off $3 an hour. And so they come and they set a minimum wage, a price floor, and they say you can't pay anybody less than whatever the minimum wage is, like $7.50 or something like that. And because of this, the demand for labor, which is employment, so this is where it gets a little tricky, right? Because the demand for labor is essentially the number of hires that happens in any particular economy or place, right, is going to be less than the number of laborers that want to work. So the quantity supplied, which is the available laborers, and so as a result, there's going to be unemployment. Similar stories with a price ceiling. It has to be above the equilibrium in order for it to actually work. If it's below the equilibrium, it doesn't work, right? If the government came in and said you can't pay people less than $1 an hour, that wouldn't change anything, right? Because the equilibrium wage rate is $3 an hour at the most unskilled labor. Does that make sense? You just bored? Yeah? Make sense? You just bored? Okay. Does it not make sense? Okay, cool. It's okay if it's boring. I just want to make sure it makes sense. Okay, so it has to be above the equilibrium. And again, my little way that I remember this one is, this, you can make it look like a floor, right? You can kind of make some people on it. They're having a little party and they're dancing around. There might be a little disco ball or something like that hanging there, right? So a price floor, when it's binding, looks like the floor graphically. Simple as that. Okay.